I'm Dr. John Greisel, and this is the first part of a two-part presentation that discusses the case study of Japan and some explanations of cultural reasons behind the case study of Japan as a society that has had a rather incredible capacity and history of social, political, economic transformation. And the purpose of these two presentations is not to tell you everything you ever have to know about Japan, which would be impossible, but to particularly focus on this in terms of war and peace, and particularly military technologies and attitudes towards being a society of war and peace, and how Japan has a rather unique status in the world of a society that has actually consciously purposely gone back in military technology and also in its policies towards being a military power. And that's what we're going to look at and try to explain. And it is related to the two courses I give, one on peace and social change and one on development, because in both cases, the transformation of Japan in terms of military technologies also related to how it was changing in terms of other types of economic productive technologies and its relations with outside powers. Japan is an amazing example of development and cultural change. And the way most people see it is that Japan made an incredible transformation from what was a hermit kingdom in the mid 19th century to what today is one of the most rich and industrial and technologically advanced societies. That's true in some ways, but it's not absolutely true. Let me tell you a little bit else about the story that I think is particularly interesting. First, Japan, example of transformation from the 1850s or from since World War I, are not an exception to the rule. In fact, Japanese society is a society that has multiple times undergone major transformations. And the type of the transformations it undergoes is that it gets shocked or aware of something outside it that it decides is necessary for incorporation. And it transforms itself, able to incorporate, to adopt and adapt without then losing a sort of core set of values and cultural practices and identities that keep it Japanese. When we go back in history, the earliest example we probably have is a lot of what we consider Japanese in terms of politics of the royal family actually seems to come out of Korea from 1,000 years ago, but is not well understood. We do know that the Japanese took on the Chinese alphabet, except they didn't take on the alphabet, they took on the symbols, and they created their own phonetic alphabet. And, of course, for the Japanese language. Then there was Buddhism that came into Japan. And again, it disappeared from India and it came into Japan, but the Japanese transformed it in very fundamental ways into their own versions. Then was one of the most interesting that people aren't very often aware of, which is Japan was not a hermit kingdom. In the 16th century, in fact, it had significant interaction with the West, and particularly with the Jesuits of the Catholic Church. And in fact, at one point, approximately 1/3 of the feudal lord houses of Japan were Christian. And so Japan was anything but a closed society. And it didn't just get religion from the West, it got military technology, it got the gun. And in fact, it became very adept at using the gun and manufacturing guns. And that proceeded to basically transform the nature of Japanese society because the gun made the common man and every man a potential weapon of mass destruction, in contrast to the old knight and the sword. And that isn't that different than what happened in medieval Europe and thereafter with the arrival of the gun. And as a result of that, major transformations. Now, actually, there are several Japanese films, and we'll give you a list at the end, that cover this period and give you very good understanding of the things I'm talking about. And I'm going to suggest you can watch and see. And one particular book called Giving Up the Gun that particularly talks about one of the most interesting things, which was with the gun, One particular clan family, the Tokugawa, so mastered the art of the battlefield that they were able to dominate the other families and actually gain control of Japan. And it was the Tokugawa who decided that they were going to close the borders because Japan, fortunately for them, was an island. Uh, and also, and this is what's so amazing, demilitarized, not exactly demilitarized, detechnologicalized, if you want to call it, reduce the level of military technology to phase out the gun, which then was a threat to them since they were on top, and to replace it with something else. And what they replaced it with was a contrived, designed, engineered reassertion of what was called the samurai code, the warrior's code, and a tremendous emphasis on the sword. But it was the same type of re-engineering of an old way of life that, in fact, you saw in Europe when Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, decided he wanted to centralize France and basically took what had been a feudal system and brought everybody to his court in Versailles and choreographed a new understanding of behavior and expectations for aristocracy that really revolved around him. And that's what the Tokugawa did. But in the process, they created this image of Japan and practice of Japan as a highly codified way of behavior with a reduced military technology on the sword, and in fact, in general, an era of great peace and prosperity. Now, I look at Japan particularly in terms of this very interesting period where it gave up the gun, because that's really very unique. But let's quickly also look what happened afterwards. After Japan opened, it readapted the gun. Rapidly, the Tokugawas were pushed out of power, and the emperor, who had always been present, was restored as the sort of central institution. And then what happened was Japan sent people all around the world to sort of see what was happening and to bring back the latest and then to adapt. And within a 40-year period, it wrote a new constitution, greatly influenced by German law. It brought in new technologies. It rearmed itself, and approximately 4 decades later, this kingdom was able to basically defeat the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War. It also then allied itself with the United States and Britain, the Allies, in World War I, in the war against Germany, and as a constitutional monarchy and sort of a democracy, but with a very interesting constitution, it took some interesting positions. In its own country, it did away basically with the samurai class. In one very interesting way, for instance, it did away with the stipends the samurais got and replaced them with financial bonds. And in its constitution, it actually, as with the gun, brought back the commoner as a soldier and required everybody to become a member of the military for military service. And after World War I, it introduced and proposed that the League of Nations actually have a clause against racism, an anti-race. And if we had accepted that, the history of the world might have been different. But it wasn't accepted because Britain and France were colonial powers, and the last thing they wanted to do was argue that all the races were equal. And so Japan further rearmed itself to become a colonial power, like Britain and France, and we got World War II. But after World War II, we got another interesting conversion where Japan, in its constitution, outlawed itself as a warring military power. It had a defense force, but it was not going to do aggressive external warfare. So you got a society that then became, over a short period of time, one of the world's major industrial powers, one of the world's major scientific powers, and yet purposely hobbled itself in terms of its power as a military force. So we're going to, in our second part now, look at that from a very quick point of view of what role culture and cultural values played in this.